Whether you are a college student or a high school student like myself, do you remember those really long tests? I know I recently taken the ACT and the SAT and they were about 3 hours, or whether it was the FCAT and whatever they're taking now, that determined whether you were going to go on to the next grade or how well you were doing in school. Well, today I would like to talk about that and why they should be taken away. Insider Education states that for many years, people have been wanting to get rid of these tests since they do not correctly predict how well a student will do in the future. And I agree with that. But because of COVID and due to not having the end of the year last year, schools have had to find different ways to assess how well students are doing. And I think this is a great step in the right direction. So what does research say about testing by Utopia? Says it is good, and I agree with that, because it revisits material, it helps critical thinking and master these skills. As I said, I agree with that. Testing isn't a bad thing. Testing has actually made me learn because I have to go back and study, and without it, I probably wouldn't have studied. So I agree with these tests being a part of the decision, but not the main focus of whether a student is doing well, whether a teacher is teaching or not. As someone who doesn't really get nervous, but someone who talks to people and who has told me that they get nervous before these tests and they do poorly on these tests, I understand that. I am such a slow reader, and I really like to dive into the text and not just barely skim over, because like for an SAT you get 6 minutes to read and 6 minutes to answer the questions. How can someone answer and fully understand the text whenever they are barely having to skim over it? So also, these tests don't give much feedback. Like, yes, as I know people who have barely done any of the work through the school year who are failing, but they pass these tests with flying colors because of how good they are at test taking. And yes, we can all learn how to test take, but many of us don't have the resources, such as myself. Like, I cannot go and spend hundreds of dollars or however many it costs to go and perfect myself at test taking or taking these SAT courses to better myself or getting a private tutor, whereas some people can, as well as like I don't have time. I was recently asked if I wanted to get better at my SAT scores to come on Mondays and Wednesdays, and I was like, well, I work, like I have to pay for college, and it's like I can't just give up. Maybe one of those days I could, but that would even be a stretch, especially with having asked my boss whether I can go or not. And as well as I recently talked to my guidance, a teacher who teaches at the moment, and she's like, this is her first year teaching. She's like, I feel like I haven't been teaching for the last couple months because I'm trying to shove everything in that we weren't able to get to because of spending more time on those kids that needed the help, or my class needing the extra help on certain subjects. And I'm like, I understand that. As a student, I felt like we were rushing the whole way and we couldn't really focus on these topics that we will need for later on that will affect these tests, but we were just learning for the test. So these tests are good until you're learning just for that single test and not for lifelong skills. And so a counter argument that I have is that some of those kids do really good on these tests, but life isn't about doing good on that one test. If you go into a job and you do good in the end, like let's say it was a perfect job, but you take 30 weeks to complete it instead of 10 because you're only putting 5% of the effort in throughout the whole time, what does that mean? That doesn't say that you're going to do good in the future, because like who is going to want somebody who only does something like that? So I don't think that's a good test or a good predictor of who you are. And as somebody who has amazing grades, does like everything in school, but can barely pass a good score on my SAT or ACT, that doesn't really count, because that isn't a good factor of whether I'm a good student or not. And so let's just say, I feel like this should be a topic more of us talk about, not just because it's Corona and we haven't gotten a chance to have those moments of testing, but because some students just aren't good testers, and that shouldn't be a main factor of whether a student passes or fails. Thank you.